Somewhere in the Arabian Sea, on the night of April 13th, 2026, a tanker turned around. Not because of a storm, not because of a mechanical failure, because of a blockade line drawn by the United States Navy. That tanker, the MV Rich Starry, was Chinese-owned, flying a Malawian flag with a falsified position signal that had been spoofing its location for 11 straight days. It was carrying methanol officially loaded in the UAE, almost certainly originating from Iran. And the moment the blockade took effect, it reversed course, publicly, visibly, recorded by commercial maritime tracking firms and verified by independent journalists. Every analyst is asking the wrong question. They are asking whether China will send warships to challenge America at Hormuz. The real question is this: why did Beijing allow its most important strategic tool, the Ghost Fleet, to be seen at all? Because what turned around that night was not just a tanker, it was a system. And systems once exposed cannot be made invisible again. This is PPR Global. We do not read headlines. We read the architecture behind them, the supply chains, the legal frameworks, the strategic calculations that governments make at 3 a.m. when no one is watching. If you want to understand how power actually moves in this world, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story is not finished. To understand why that single U-turn matters, you need to understand the system that made it possible in the first place. For the better part of a decade, Beijing constructed what is arguably the most sophisticated energy procurement architecture in modern history, not through military force, not through open diplomacy, through deliberate layered obscurity. Here's how it worked. China imports over 10 million barrels of crude oil every single day. A significant portion of that volume transits the Strait of Hormuz from Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. That part is well documented, publicly acknowledged, and strategically accepted by all parties. But there is another layer underneath. Iran, operating under sustained American sanctions since 2018, needed a buyer willing to absorb political risk in exchange for deeply discounted crude. Beijing was that buyer. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in ways that went far beyond a simple transaction. China received oil at below market prices, quietly routed through a network of intermediary vessels. Iran received hard currency, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic cover inside multilateral institutions. The 2021 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, a 25-year agreement between Beijing and Tehran, formalized this relationship, exchanging Chinese technology and construction capital for guaranteed energy access. But the operational mechanism that made it all function was the Ghost Fleet. Look at the data carefully. Chinese customs records have shown zero direct imports from Iran since 2022. Zero. Yet during that same period, China's recorded imports of Malaysian crude oil reached 1.3 million barrels per day, a figure that exceeds Malaysia's entire national production capacity by more than double. The oil did not come from Malaysia. It came from Iran. Transferred ship to ship in international waters off the coast of Southeast Asia, then reflagged, redocumented, and delivered to Chinese refineries under a different origin story. The vessels operating in this network flew flags from landlocked nations. They disabled or falsified their automatic identification system transponders. Payments moved through layers of intermediary entities designed to obscure the trail. The whole architecture was built around a single strategic principle: plausible deniability. As long as no transaction could be directly attributed to Beijing, no secondary sanction could be cleanly applied. And for years, it worked. Commercial maritime intelligence firms tracked anomalies. Western governments issued warnings. But the system operated below the threshold that would trigger a formal, documented, legally actionable response. This was not an accident. This was engineering. Beijing had constructed a parallel energy supply chain that was economically efficient, politically defensible, and operationally invisible. It allowed China to publicly condemn sanctions while quietly benefiting from the price differential they created. It allowed Iranian oil revenue to keep flowing while Washington's financial pressure was supposed to be cutting it off. That was the equilibrium. That was the architecture. Invisible, functional, deniable. until the night of April 13th, 2026, when a single vessel spoofing its position, flying the flag of a landlocked country, carrying cargo with a falsified origin, reversed course in full view of every commercial tracking system on the planet. And the lights came on. On April 12th, 2026, negotiations in Islamabad collapsed. United States Vice President J.D. Vance had traveled to Pakistan to broker a long-term ceasefire agreement with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The talks failed to produce a deal. Within hours, President Trump declared that the United States Navy would begin blockading all vessels entering or exiting Iranian ports and coastal areas, effective 10 in the morning Eastern Time on April 13th. United States Central Command clarified the scope immediately. This was not a full closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Ships transiting to or from non-Iranian destinations would not be stopped. The target was specific: Iranian maritime commerce, Iranian oil revenue, the financial engine keeping Tehran's war economy operational, 3 carrier strike groups, over 20 warships, satellite surveillance, P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance aircraft, minesweeping operations already underway inside the strait. The United States deployed what analysts at Stars and Stripes described as roughly 41% of its actively deployed naval vessels worldwide to a single choke point. By any conventional measure, this was overwhelming force. But here is what the headlines missed entirely. The strategic rupture that occurred on April 13th was not primarily military. America did not sink a Chinese vessel. America did not board a Chinese crew. America did not fire a single shot at Beijing's interests. What America did was far more surgical. It turned on the lights. The MV Rich Starry had been spoofing its automatic identification system transponder for 11 consecutive days before the blockade took effect. It was Chinese-owned. It flew a Malawian flag. It declared its cargo as methanol loaded in the United Arab Emirates. Every element of its operational profile was designed for invisibility. Then the blockade was announced, and the vessel reversed course publicly in real time, captured by Lloyd's List Intelligence, verified by BBC Verify, logged by KPLR and marine traffic commercial maritime data firms whose records are used by insurers, regulators, and legal bodies across the international system. The Ghost Fleet did not fail because American warships intercepted it. The Ghost Fleet failed because reversing course in response to a blockade announcement generated a documented, time-stamped, commercially verified behavioral signature. That signature is now on record, not classified, not buried in an intelligence report. Publicly accessible to any lawyer, sanctions compliance officer, or government body that wants to construct a secondary sanctions case against the financial and logistics networks behind that vessel. The architecture Beijing spent years building was not dismantled by force. It was photographed. And in the modern sanctions enforcement environment, being photographed is frequently worse than being fired upon. Weapons destroy one ship. Evidence destroys an entire network. That is the paradigm shift. Not the blockade itself, what the blockade revealed. Now we go deeper. Because the surface narrative China backed down, America showed force is the least interesting part of this story. There are 4 layers here, and each one opens into something larger. Layer 1, the mistake everyone is talking about versus the mistake that actually matters. Every major outlet is framing this crisis around a single question. Will China send warships to Hormuz? Will Beijing escalate militarily? Will this become a naval confrontation between 2 nuclear powers? That framing is analytically lazy. China's decision not to deploy warships to Hormuz is not a mistake. It is a correct calculation. 3 United States carrier strike groups, over 20 warships, continuous air patrol coverage, submarine presence, and satellite surveillance represent a concentration of naval power that no rational defense planner in Beijing would challenge directly in April 2026, particularly while Taiwan tensions remain structurally unresolved. The decision not to fight at Hormuz is sound strategy. The mistake is something else entirely, and it is quieter, and it is more damaging. Chinese Defense Minister Dong Jun made public statements in the days surrounding the blockade announcement. The precise wording of those statements became contested almost immediately. Newsweek published quotes attributed to Dong Jun, then issued a formal correction acknowledging there was no verified record of those specific statements. A detailed analysis published by the Beijing Channel newsletter identified multiple viral versions of the quote circulating on social media platforms as unverified or fabricated. Here is the strategic problem. Whether those specific quotes were authentic or not is almost secondary. The information environment processed them as real. Millions of views. Picked up by artificial intelligence aggregators, read by Iranian officials, Gulf state governments, and Beijing's partners across the global south who were watching to see how China would respond. The signal that entered the global information system was this. Beijing spoke publicly, assertedly, and then its tankers turned around. Words without corresponding action in a high-visibility crisis do not simply fail to help. They actively damage the credibility architecture that underpins every future deterrent statement Beijing might need to make. That is the first layer of the mistake. Layer 2, the economics of deniability and what happens when deniability is priced into a system that suddenly loses it. The ghost fleet model was economically elegant precisely because its core cost structure depended on invisibility. Consider the actual operational arithmetic. A sanctioned Iranian crude cargo moving through the Ghost Fleet network trades at a discount to Brent crude estimates from energy analysts have ranged from $15 to $30 per barrel below market price in recent years. At volumes of several 100,000 barrels per cargo, that discount represents tens of millions of dollars per shipment in direct savings to Chinese refiners. The entire discount exists because of political risk absorption. Chinese entities accepted the legal and reputational exposure of dealing with sanctioned Iranian oil. The Ghost Fleet infrastructure, false flags, falsified manifests, ship-to-ship transfers, intermediary ownership structures was the mechanism that kept that exposure below the threshold of actionable enforcement. Now run the calculation in the other direction. The moment Rich Starry reversed course, and that reversal was logged by commercial maritime intelligence platforms, the vessel's behavioral data entered a permanent, publicly accessible record. Lloyd's List Intelligence, K-Peeler, Marine Traffic, these are not intelligence agency databases. They are commercial subscription services used by shipping insurers, port authorities, trade finance banks, and sanctions compliance departments at financial institutions worldwide. United States Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has previously used commercially available maritime tracking data in sanctions designation cases. Naval War College professor James Kraska confirmed to United States Naval Institute News that the current blockade operation aligns with established frameworks under the Newport Manual on the Law of Naval Warfare. What this means in practical terms, Washington now possesses commercially sourced, independently verified behavioral evidence of a Chinese-owned vessel operating in patterns consistent with Iranian sanctions evasion, captured at the precise moment of a declared naval enforcement operation. That evidence did not require a boarding. It did not require classified intelligence. It was generated by the vessel's own response to the blockade announcement. Secondary sanctions based on this type of evidentiary record could reach Chinese financial institutions financing Ghost Fleet operations, Chinese insurance entities covering those vessels, and Chinese port facilities processing their cargo. The network, not just the ship, becomes exposed. Beijing built a system priced for invisibility. Visibility does not simply reduce the discount. It potentially inverts the entire cost structure. Layer 3, why Beijing could not simply stay silent and how that inability created the trap. This requires understanding the domestic political constraints operating on Chinese leadership simultaneously with the external strategic ones. China's strategic petroleum reserves are estimated at sufficient coverage for approximately 120 days of consumption without Iranian supply, according to analysis published by the Jerusalem Post. That number sounds comfortable. It is not when you factor in what happens to refinery margins during that period. Chinese refineries, particularly independent refiners, sometimes called teapot refineries operating in Shandong province, built their business models around access to discounted Iranian crude. They do not have the contractual relationships or the credit facilities to rapidly pivot to Saudi Aramco or Abu Dhabi National Oil Company spot market purchases at full market prices. The margin compression during a transition period is immediate and significant. This creates visible domestic economic pressure within weeks, not months. At the same time, a complete public silence from Beijing while Chinese-owned vessels are visibly turning around in response to an American blockade announcement generates its own political cost inside China. The Communist Party's legitimacy architecture includes a consistent narrative of Chinese strength, sovereignty, and resistance to American unilateral pressure. So Beijing faced a genuine dilemma with no clean exit. Silence protects the ghost fleet's deniability architecture, but silence reads domestically as capitulation. Public statements defend the domestic narrative. But public statements, when not followed by corresponding action, expose the gap between declared capability and demonstrated will. The trap was not set by Washington deliberately targeting this specific dilemma. The trap emerged structurally from the intersection of the blockade's visibility and Beijing's simultaneous domestic and international audience management requirements. That structural trap, not any single decision, is the deepest layer of the strategic mistake. Layer 4, the counter-argument. Examined honestly. Intellectual honesty requires engaging with the strongest version of the opposing analysis. Several serious analysts argue that Beijing is not making a mistake at all, that the wait and adapt posture has a strong historical track record in Chinese strategic behavior, that Rich Starry eventually transited successfully on its second attempt, demonstrating the blockade's inherent limitations, that China is simultaneously applying pressure through halting fuel exports to Japan and South Korea, purchasing American liquefied natural gas to reduce tariff exposure, and expanding energy influence across Southeast Asia. These observations are factually grounded. The blockade is demonstrably not airtight. United States Naval Institute News reported that at least 4 of the 7 vessels that initially reversed course subsequently resumed their planned routes. The selectivity of enforcement reveals real operational constraints on Washington's side as well. The counterargument's strongest point is this: China may be absorbing short-term reputational cost in exchange for long-term strategic positioning, betting that the blockade is unsustainable over weeks and months, given the logistical burden of maintaining 3 carrier strike groups at operational tempo indefinitely. That bet may prove correct on the military sustainability question. Where the counter-argument weakens is on the evidentiary question. Even if the blockade collapses in 2 weeks, even if Rich Starry and every vessel like it resumes full operations through Hormuz, the behavioral record generated during this period does not expire. The documented patterns do not disappear from Lloyd's List databases. The legal framework for secondary sanctions enforcement does not reset. Short-term adaptation is entirely possible. The permanent alteration of the evidentiary landscape for Ghost Fleet operations is already done, and that is the calculation Beijing may have underweighted. Pull the camera back now, because what is happening at Hormuz is not a regional crisis with global implications. It is a global restructuring event with a regional trigger. 3 concentric waves, each one larger than the last. Wave 1. The energy supply chain is being repriced in real time. Before April 13, 2026, the global oil market operated under a specific set of assumptions. Iranian crude, moving through Ghost Fleet infrastructure, was effectively available to price-sensitive buyers at a meaningful discount to market benchmarks. That discount suppressed the marginal cost of energy procurement for a significant portion of Asian refining capacity. That assumption is now under direct pressure. India, the world's third largest oil importer, had structured meaningful portions of its energy procurement around access to discounted Iranian crude. The blockade does not simply inconvenience Indian refiners. It forces immediate reallocation to spot market purchases at full Brent-linked pricing. The cost differential, absorbed across millions of barrels per month, translates directly into downstream inflationary pressure on an economy where energy costs are structurally significant. Japan and South Korea present an even sharper paradox. Both nations are more dependent on Hormuz transit for their total energy supply than China is. Both are American treaty allies. Neither can publicly oppose the blockade without fracturing their security relationships with Washington. Both are absorbing energy market disruption as a direct consequence of an operation nominally designed to protect the international order they benefit from. The asymmetry is striking. A blockade targeting Iranian oil revenue is simultaneously functioning as an undeclared energy tax on American allies in Northeast Asia. That tension does not resolve cleanly, and it will compound with every week the operation continues. Wave 2. Commercial maritime data just became an instrument of legal enforcement, and nobody has fully processed what that means. This is the wave that will matter longest. The enforcement architecture underpinning the Hormuz blockade is not primarily built on warship interceptions. It is built on data, satellite tracking, automatic identification system behavioral analysis, commercial maritime intelligence from firms like Lloyd's List, Kepler, and marine traffic platforms originally designed for insurance underwriting and trade finance, now generating evidentiary records in an active naval enforcement operation. Naval War College professor James Kraska confirmed to United States Naval Institute News that the current operation aligns with established law of naval warfare frameworks. If Washington moves towards secondary sanctions designations based on commercially sourced behavioral data from this period, it will establish a legal precedent with consequences extending far beyond Iran and China. Every ghost fleet operation globally, Venezuelan crude moving under alternative flags, Russian oil transiting through shadow intermediaries, any sanctioned commodity moving through deliberate obscurity now exists in an environment where its behavioral signature during a declared enforcement operation is permanently archived in commercially accessible databases. The rules of the invisible supply chain did not change because of military force. They changed because commercial data infrastructure matured to the point where invisibility is no longer reliably achievable at scale. That is a structural shift in how economic sanctions function as a geopolitical instrument. It will be studied in international law programs for the next 2 decades. Wave 3, the multipolar credibility test, just produced its first measurable result. For years, the emerging alternative to American-led international order has been described in terms of institutions. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS expansion, bilateral currency swap arrangements designed to reduce dollar dependency, the rhetorical architecture of a world where American unilateral pressure can be collectively absorbed and deflected. Hormuz in April 2026 is the first high-visibility naval stress test of whether that architecture functions operationally when it matters. The measurable result, based strictly on verified facts: no Chinese warships appeared at Hormuz. No Russian naval vessels repositioned toward the strait. The coalition supporting the American blockade consisted of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. The United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Australia declined to participate. What this reveals is more nuanced than simple American victory or Chinese defeat. It reveals that the multipolar order, as currently constituted, lacks the coordination infrastructure to generate a coherent collective naval response within the time frame that a fast-moving crisis demands. Individual nations calculated their own exposure and acted accordingly. China absorbed reputational cost rather than military risk. Russia signaled diplomatic opposition without operational commitment. Regional states made bilateral calculations based on their own security relationships. The result was not a demonstration of American dominance. It was a demonstration of collective action failure among the nations most invested in offering an alternative to American dominance. That gap between the rhetoric of multipolarity, and the operational reality of uncoordinated individual responses is the most consequential finding of this entire episode. And Beijing knows it. Step back from the tactical details now. And look at what has actually changed. Before April 13th, 2026, the Ghost Fleet was a functioning strategic instrument, economically efficient, operationally invisible, politically deniable. It allowed Beijing to maintain plausible distance from Iranian sanctions while capturing the financial benefits of below-market crude procurement. After April 13th, that instrument is not destroyed, but it is documented. And in the architecture of modern sanctions enforcement, documentation is the precondition for everything that follows. That is the structural shift. Everything else flows from it. Scenario 1, the blockade ends within weeks. This is the higher probability path based on current indicators. The ceasefire framework expires April 21st. Diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran remain open. Multiple analysts have noted that Iran's incentive to negotiate increases with every day that oil revenue approaches zero. If a deal is reached and the blockade is lifted, the immediate pressure on Chinese energy procurement dissolves. Ghost Fleet operations resume. Beijing's public statements are quietly forgotten in the news cycle. But the evidentiary record generated during this period does not dissolve with the blockade. The behavioral signatures logged by Lloyd's List, Kepler, and marine traffic between April 13th and the date of any eventual lifting remain permanently archived. Washington retains the option to activate secondary sanctions based on that record at any future moment of its choosing, during a trade negotiation, during a Taiwan contingency, during any future episode where additional leverage against Beijing is strategically useful. The blockade ends. The leverage does not. Scenario 2. The blockade extends beyond April 21st. If the ceasefire collapses and military operations resume, the pressure gradients accelerate sharply. Chinese strategic petroleum reserves, estimated at approximately 120 days of coverage, begin drawing down against a backdrop of constrained replenishment options. Indian and Northeast Asian energy markets face sustained repricing. Secondary sanctions discussions inside Washington move from theoretical to operational. In this scenario, Beijing faces an escalating choice between absorbing compounding economic damage and escalating on an alternative front, where Chinese military advantages are more favorable, most plausibly the South China Sea, where the Scarborough Shoal situation has already shown movement. The danger in this scenario is not direct Hormuz confrontation. It is crisis displacement pressure, absorbed at one choke point, generating kinetic response at another. Two variables to watch above everything else. First, the Iranian rial. If the currency accelerates its collapse in the coming days, internal pressure on Tehran's leadership becomes the dominant variable, faster and more decisive than any external military calculation. Second, Ghost Fleet behavior in the next 72 hours. If Chinese-affiliated vessels continue probing the blockade boundary, Beijing has chosen controlled escalation. If they pull back entirely, Beijing has chosen to wait and rebuild deniability after the crisis passes. Those two data points, tracked through open sources available to anyone, will tell you which scenario is unfolding before any government makes a public announcement. The distance between what nations say and what their ships do has always been the most reliable intelligence signal available. Watch the ships. What does this crisis reveal about the actual operational capacity of the multipolar order? And if commercial maritime data becomes a standard instrument of sanctions enforcement going forward, which supply chains built on deliberate obscurity are now structurally vulnerable in ways their architects have not yet fully accounted for. Leave your analysis in the comments below. Subscribe and turn on notifications. The next move in this crisis will happen before the next headline does.